At the moment, we only have the API route for logging users in. We also need the front-end logic in the auth form component. There, we have this check whether we are logging in, but we're not doing anything if we are. Well, here we need to sign the user in. And here we now don't need to send our own HTTP request. We don't need to configure it ourselves. And we shouldn't. Instead, here we'll again import from next-auth, but now from next-auth/client. And from there, we can import the sign-in function. This sign-in function. That's a function which we can call in our component to send a sign-in request. And the request will be sent automatically. So we just call sign-in here, and now we can pass in some data here. The first argument describes the provider with which we want to sign in, because we could have multiple providers in the same application. Here it's the credentials provider, and hence we should write it like this. Then we can also pass a second argument here. That is a configuration object now, where we can configure how the sign-in process should work. And specifically here, we can add a redirect field and set this to false. You might remember that I said that when next-auth is used here on the backend, in this API route, that when we throw an error here, because authentication failed, that by default, Next.js would redirect us to another page, to an error page. And that is something we could utilize. We can then set up such an error page, and we can configure that error page. You can check out the next options for the credentials provider to learn more about that. But more often, you typically want to leave the user on the page where he or she is and just show some error message there. So if we are logging in here, I don't want to be redirected if it fails. I maybe just want to show an overlay or a little text here below the inputs. And to avoid that we are redirected, we can set redirect to false in that second argument of the sign-in method, so in this configuration object. Now, when setting redirect to false, sign-in will actually return a promise, which eventually yields us a result. The promise will always resolve. It will not be rejected, even if we have an error in our backend authentication code. But if we had an error there, result would be an object that contains information about the error. If we have no error during authentication, result is still an object, but without the error information. So this will never throw an error, it will never be rejected, it's just the content of this result object which will differ. And now besides passing redirect false, we also want to pass our credential data to the backend. We do this in this second argument as well, because it is actually the second argument as a whole, which is received in our authorize function as this credentials argument here. So this credentials parameter is that second argument, which we pass to sign in. And here I'm trying to access an email and a password field, and therefore to make sure that this works in auth form, besides setting redirect to false, we should also add in the email and set this to entered email, and add a password key and set this to entered password. And with that, we're sending this sign-in request, and I'll now just log that result here. And that's all we have to do when it comes to signing users in. If we now save everything, we go back to that login page and reload it. If I enter a valid email here, but an invalid password, and I click login, I get could not log you in. Which makes sense, because that proves that we made it past this first check, where we check for the general existence of a user, but we then failed when we tried to get the password. And you see what I meant? We didn't get an error here, instead we just have the result object, which has an error value. Now if I do enter an invalid email address, which is not part of the database, I get no user found. Now if I do enter valid credentials though, then we see that error now is null. So now we got no error, instead we succeeded. And that is how we can sign a user in. Now we can create users and log them in. And we get this yes/no response. What we're not doing yet, though, is working with that token. Because, of course, in the front end, in our front end components, when we get the result here, we could now check if result error is falsy, which means we have no error, which means we succeeded. And we could then set some auth state, maybe also with help of React context or Redux, and use that state to change what we see. For example, to change the options in our header. We could now do that. But whenever we reload, that state would be lost because we start a brand new single page application when we reload. All the state, which was only stored in memory from the last visit, would be lost. And that's not what we want. That's also not what we have to accept, because that's exactly why we have this token concept. We can store that token in some more permanent storage than just our memory. And we can then also use that token to send requests to potentially protected APIs, like the Change Password API, which we haven't implemented yet. And therefore, in the next lecture, let's now see how Next.js helps us find out whether a user is authenticated or not, starting on the client, later also for the API routes.